lot of talking, and I hope it's already not overloading the system. Because we still have half a day of what we started out with, but in a very different, now we're sort of moving away from Dhvani and Samaja into other areas of resonance. Where else does craft and art find space to exist, thrive, and grow and transform and transgress and everything? Where art has entered a space that is not directly related to people, that is not directly resonating with people, as in a market or an audience and so on. It resonates with something else in space and in time, and that is with precedences, that's with history. So in the afternoon we're going to look a little bit at our idea of history as practitioners, and, or as I can put it, historicity, a sense of historicity in our own practice, and actual history as a practice. So in this, we're basically talking about the space in which we are working. So technology and technique are also spaces, and these are spaces that have a very powerful impact on the way we will relate to fundamental concepts that even we choose to hold. Fundamental concepts, fundamental ways and ethics of working and all that, but the minute that space gets mediated by an instrument, a tool, a technology, a set of techniques. Again, we can use the word Shastra, but now we have to move into a more sort of mechanical, in that sense, definition of the word Shastra. A more functional and operational definition of Shastra. So then what happens? I mean, people use relationships to standardize. No? This morning we were looking at how social relationships are being used in order to standardize form. What other forms of standardization, what other ways of standardization can be achieved? Of course, in resonance with historicity within the practice itself, which is कैसे कर रहे थे लोग, नियम कैसे पाल रहे थे, क्या लिखा है, क्या compile करके रखा है, what are the precedences, what will work, what will not work. And of course there are two parts to it. One is just remembering these things, and the other is taking it forward into either creating slight sort of changes and transgressions, or adapting new forms, or creating a new form. I mean, what are we going to do if we are not going to transgress? What are we going to do if we are not going to push forward? But the other side of the question is, how are we going to anchor? What are we going to anchor ourselves in while we do all these things? And this is also a space. And I'm really delighted to have Keshav Chaitanya Kunte ji here. He's going to be talking about the negotiations. I think he will just pick up and continue from what he was talking about yesterday, these negotiations between idioms and rules and techniques and metaphors and so on in construction, in the actual construction of music, in the mechanics of music.
So, what was this?
Folk song? Folk song?
Not really. Yeah, but it was a folk expression, we can call it. This was actually a hawker's call. He's selling jamun. Ah. And the music students must have understood that he was using a tune of Rag Yaman Kalyan. So, usually we talk or we tend to talk about art music or Raga Sangeet when we talk about in general tradition or Shastra. But my premise is it is not just confined to, or the Shastra or the tradition is not just confined to art music or Raga Sangeet. It actually percolates in all strata, as Dr. Ranade, Ashok Da Ranade has put forth the theory of 6 categories of music. First 3 categories are developmental categories, like primitive music, folk music, and art music. Usually we call it as classical music, but we deny that term because it's very specific to Western music, and as we know it's like Baroque period and Romantic period and classic. So that is a different story, I will not go into that. But these 3 are the, in a way, developmental phases. Then we have 3 more categories which are applied categories: religious music, popular music, and confluence music. Again, I will not go in the details of these categories and how they are defined musicologically. That is probably for some other session. But all this encompasses the Indian music as a whole. Let us listen another small clip. This is a very old record, gramophone record, around 1917 to 1920s. And you will probably, the Marathi speaking persons will probably can understand what the singer is singing actually. Let's listen to that. Arati of Shankar. But we see this tune is very different than what we sing today. So again there is a question about tradition. And we can see Raga Tattva in this also. Let us listen to another song. This is a record around 1936, and the singer was a very famous singer from Maharashtra and from Pune. Let us listen to it first and then I will talk. This is Savitribai Phule Pune, a famous singer, who was known for her Lavani singing as well as Thumri and a little bit of Khayal singing. So usually what is referred to as folk music, Lavani, is not really that folk, what we think. We can clearly see the glimpses of Rag Bhairav Thatte ki Gauri in this. So again, the question arises about which tradition are we talking about? Is it Raga Sangeet tradition or religious music tradition or so-called folk music tradition? What we are negotiating. So let me first explain what I think of music, or what is my definition of music. As we know, in our ancient treatises, music is always defined as Gita Madhyam Tatha Nrityam Trayam Sangeetam Uchyate. But I think this is not a definition. This explains the scope. The dancing, instrumental music and vocal music, this is encompassed under a blanket term of Sangeeta. And interestingly, we find some other terms also, like Gandharva. When it is addressed Gandharva, it means only vocal music and instrumental music. And such terms, again, this terminology becomes an integral part of the musicological tradition, which is reflected in musicians' acts. As we know that around a century back, when Pandit Paluskar founded his music institution at Lahore, he named it as Gandharva Mahavidyalaya and not Sangeet Vidyalaya, because he was not going to teach dancing there. He was very clear that he is going to handle only singing and instrumental music. So he labeled it as Gandharva. So we get to know that, these terms, these musicological insights were there in the performing musician also. Going further, Gita is the word only for singing. So Sangeeta is a very larger term. It has a larger compass. But even though Gandharva, what is Gandharva actually? Singing and instrumental music. But what is music? So I have specified this term as music is a deliberate design of sound and silence. It's a deliberate design. Yes, it is a design, but it's a deliberate, and that's why we don't call bird songs as music of human beings. It might sound musical to our ears, but it is not our music. So it is a deliberate design of sound and silence with creation of melodic structures coupled with rhythmic formations, with or without lyrical content, presented through human voices, instruments or ensembles. And what is the purpose? To express or communicate our emotions or thoughts, and both are equally important. When we talk about folk music or popular music, it also conveys certain thoughts, not just emotions. And when we enter into Raga Sangeet, most of the times it is musical thought that we project. emotions or emotive content can be a byproduct of it. So this is what I think of music making. So it's a deliberate design of sound and silence. And talking of tradition in India, musical tradition, as we know, usually we talk about Hindustani music, as I last day explained what is Hindustani music, and Carnatic music. These are the two major traditions that we locate. But mind you, there are many more such traditions which involve the concept of raga, tala, prabandha or composition in a very different manner. And they have their own musicology, so to say, or theory or shastra to address all these concepts in their own way. And these are like traditions related to religious institutions like Gurbani Sangeet or Gurumat Sangeet, Pushti Margi Sangeet or Haveli Sangeet, Sankirtana Sangeet of Manipur, Odishi Sangeet, and Sopana Sangeet of Kerala. Besides these traditions, I think every region has its own folk music tradition. As you have experienced the Mangniya tradition in this morning session, it is altogether a different tradition and which is very close, or we can say it's heading towards art music. It is in between folk music and art music because they have their own terminology and ways of exploring the melodic structures. So it is not Hindustani music and it is not folk music also. It is elevated to a certain stage from folk music to art music. So there is a journey or uplift, upward movement, we can say. And of course, there are many popular music traditions in India, like Marathi Bhavagit or Natya Sangeet, Rabindra Sangeet. There are many such traditions. And all these traditions have their own codified theories. They have their shastra. And that's why we usually use the term Shastrokta Sangeet rather than Shastriya Sangeet. Because every music tradition has its own grammar or shastra. What is ultimately shastra? It's paddhati or pranali or a system of grammar or codified thought, do's and don'ts, what is aesthetic or not, and how to go about it, how to handle these concepts of melodic elaboration or rhythmic formations and creating certain rasa out of that. All kind of music making has its own grammar. It has shastra. Folk music also has shastra. Like when you experience the Mangniya's music, there is certain rules. You cannot play kartale whatever way you want. But that shastra is not put forth maybe in words, and that's why most of the folk musicians cannot explain. Or sometimes they don't want to explain. And mostly such codified knowledge is transferred to others or other generations by imitation or observation. तो इसलिए हमें ऐसा नहीं मिलता कि हमारे यहाँ ओवी गायन का प्रथमा ते विशारद का क्लासेस कंडक्ट हम करेंगे, ऐसा नहीं हमें मिलता. हमें क्यों मिलता है सिर्फ राग संगीत के बारे में ऐसा? Because we have a certain scholastic method. It's methodology of transferring knowledge. It's certain, and the shastra is told. It is ukta, and that is why we call it shastrokta sangeet, not shastriya sangeet. Then there are always a tussle between two traditions, we can say, a tradition of performers and scholar musicians. I'm not using the word musicologist here because it's a very modern kind of term. From Bharat to Bhatkhande or from Ramamatya to Ranade, they never claimed themselves as musicologists. They were performing musicians or they were scholar musicians who codified the traditional knowledge with a certain insight, and they formulated the contemporary grammar. And again, it was contemporary grammar. And that's why even in Sharangivat Sangeet Ratnakar we find that he sometimes explained that this was in practice earlier, but today we don't find it. So and so. Now I'm projecting this in this newer manner. He also explains some Adhuna Prasiddha Rag. For the first time in musicological text, we find this concept of Adhuna Prasiddha Rag in Brihadeshi, in 8th century treatise or 9th century treatise. So musicology always tries to blend what was there and what is there. And also it gives a direction for the future progress. And that's why, who were the musicologists in India? Primarily they were scholar musicians or teachers, and that's why we find most of the musicological treatises in form of Lakshana Granthas and Karana Granthas. We rarely find Lakshya Granthas in ancient and medieval times. Most of the Lakshya Granthas are from 17th century onwards. Do you know what is Lakshya Grantha, Lakshana Grantha and Karana Grantha? Okay, I will explain it in short. Lakshana Granthas are basically grammatical texts. Lakshya Granthas are, they point out about what is to perform or the performing repertoire. So the songs, the ragas, or the process of elaboration of the raga or tal, all that is explained in Lakshya Granthas. So last day we talked about Bhatkande's efforts. So he handled both texts. His Hindustani Sangeet Paddhati or Lakshya Sangeetam is a Lakshana Grantha, and Kramik Pustak Malika is a Lakshya Grantha. Sometimes there are Karana Granthas also. Like if you go in market and search for books on music, you will find many guidebooks, Sangeet Visharad Alankar type books. So what are they? These are Karana Granthas, practical manuals. And then there is another category called Bhashya Grantha or Tika Grantha. So these are commentaries or updations of the prior texts. Again, I will come back to Dr. Ranade's another interesting theory. He has seen the musicology in Indian context on 3 levels, and these 3 levels are very interesting. The first level, he tells, is Sangeeta Atma Shastra. Sangeeta Atma Shastra. That means it's a core element of the theory directly related to the performance. And we find that most of the musicians, or mostly from the oral tradition, we find the knowledge of this level of theory. Every musician knows what is the rag, what to do and what not to do in this rag, on which note you should land or which note should be not accented or accentuated. So this kind of knowledge, which is directly related to the performance, is Sangeetatma Shastra. Then the second level is Sangeeta Vishaya Shastra. It's theory about music. It's a study of the aspects which have a connection with music performance, but they don't directly impact the performance. Like, and this also can be differed in different traditions, like notation system. In Western music is Sangeetatmak, but for Hindustani musicians, notation is secondary thing. As we know that just a century back, musicians mostly didn't know how to write the music. The art of notating was not there. Yes, very few musicians were aware of that, but mostly it was orally practiced, or it was internalized with memory, and that's why most of the musicians took pride in having memorized thousands of compositions. There is a very interesting anecdote about Ustad Alladia Khasa. It's mentioned in one of the books of his disciple. When he was around 90 years old, one of his disciples was Leelatai Shirgaonkar from Bombay, that time Bombay. And once Leelatai's father, Anantarao Shirgaonkar, who was a barrister and a very well-known or esteemed person in Mumbai culture, he asked, actually there was incidents when Khasa was teaching Rag Purvi to this little girl about 18 or 20 years old, and he was 90 years old. And he was teaching Rag Purvi, and Anantarao asked, which other bandishes do you remember in this raga? So he went on and sang around 45 Bada Khayal compositions in that. So he was awestruck and he said, you are the ocean of knowledge. So खां साहब वो लिखते हैं कि खां साहब के आंखों में आंसू आ गए और उन्होंने कहा कि मैं तो एक बूंद भी नहीं हूँ. मेरे गुरु और मेरे चचा जहांगीर खां साहब को 10,000 बंदिशें याद थी, मुझे 5,000. और उनसे भी ज़्यादा मेरे जो पिता और पहले उस्ताद रहे ख्वाजा अहमद खान, उनको 15 से 20,000 बंदिशें याद थी. Now we will forget a little bit exaggeration in this, because most of the musicians take pride in exaggerating the things. But still, we find that, oh, there is a large repertoire that was passed on through the oral tradition, and they were memorizing it. And that's why, as Srijan mentioned last day, Kothi Wale Gavaiya, that was a great title for musicians. जिनके पास खजाना होता था बंदिशों का रागों का, वो कोठी वाले गवई कहलाते. So this oral tradition is very much important, and we find that even the Shastric tradition or scholastic tradition was also a part of oral tradition. Most of the musicological texts were learned by heart. There were very rarely, we find that there were manuscripts of the musicological texts with the Shastrikas or the Pandits. We find that most of the times till medieval ages, such manuscripts were stored in the royal court libraries. That's why we find Saraswati Mal Library of Tanjore or Jaipur or Jodhpur's Gunjan Khana libraries, from where actually Bhatkhande or Dake Joshi excavated these manuscripts and collected them, edited them, and then published. That was a great work they did. We discussed about two first levels of musicology, as Dr. Ranade explained, Sangeetatma Shastra and Sangeeta Sambandha Shastra. And the third level of musicology is Sangeeta Vishaya Shastra. Now, this is it seems to be a very new kind of musicological area. The theory related to music, that is the areas of investigation which are not directly related to performance, and also doesn't influence the performance directly, but certainly do have cultural connections with music making on a larger level, and naturally it has an interdisciplinary approach. So when we think of interdisciplinary approach, so it's a very modern or postmodern thing that But it is not like that. If you peep into Sangeet Ratnakar, you will find, oh, he is talking about interdisciplinary approach, because he is trying to join the musicological concepts with darshanas. Physiology, like in the first chapter of Sangeet Ratnakar, he explains the physiology. How a human being is born, Pindotpatti Prakaran and Vishwotpatti Prakaran. So he's putting the musicological thought on a larger canvas with cultural connotations. And you can find there are many such connections, like he's trying to link it with Ayurveda also. Because he was a scholar of many areas, he could do that. Unfortunately, we find that after say 13th or 14th century, the musicological text, the focus is being narrowed down. Like Bharata to Sangeet Ratnakar, they talk about Sangeeta, that is Nritya, Gayan, Vadan. Later on, they have skipped dancing. So we find from 14th century onward that dancing is not addressed in the musicological texts. There are separate texts on dancing. They only focus on vocal and instrumental music. Going further down to 17th to 18th century, we find that now the musicological texts are only talking about vocal music. And with coming to Bhatkande, he only talks about khayal vocalism. But yes, of course, after say 20th century, we find that again the scope is being broadened by the scholars like J.H. Ranade or later Dr. Ashok Da Ranade, and that's why we call him as a founder of Indian cultural musicology. And now what is cultural musicology? Like Sharande was telling the same story, cultural musicology. Ranade is also talking about the same. But the perspective had changed. So the tradition of musicology is there. Though in some period it is broken tradition, we again find the same line is being continued.
Sorry, what was the second category?
Sangeet Atma Shastra, then second is Sangeeta Vishaya Shastra, and third Sangeeta Sambandha Shastra. So usually in Sangeeta Atma Shastra we can find that what areas are discussed, features of Raga Tal, compositions for vocal or instrumental music, elaboration or developmental techniques, Vistara Kriya, then embellishments, ornaments, genres or forms of music, voice production techniques, aspects of organology or Vadya Shastra, which are directly related to performance. Like yesterday we were talking about the veena making. That will be this part of Sangeetatma Shastra. Because the musicians were knowing about it thoroughly. The dimensions they were knowing at that time. Today we don't know, unfortunately. आपको अगर तानपुरा चाहिए तो आप बता नहीं सकते कि उसकी डंडी कितनी चौड़ी होनी चाहिए या उसका तुम्बा क्या होना चाहिए. Most of the musicians don't know today, but in earlier times they used to know all about that, and that's why most of the musicians were able to produce the instruments on their demand. जैसे डागरे घराने में तो है ही, लेकिन ये भी बताया जाता कि विष्णु दिगंबर पलुस्कर why he set up a factory of instruments in Lahore because he had this vision. Even going further, he established a printing press to print his own musicological works and distribute it amongst a larger part of the society. Now this was again a different kind of stance with a sort of music coming into the public sector from the private sector, to making it available to larger masses and not just confining it to the gharana systems or the traditional communities of musicians. In Sangeetatma Shastra we also find some elements of performing strategies and of course the knowledge of musical traditions, gharana or sampradaya. In Sangeeta Vishaya Shastra we find some areas like musical mnemonics, phonetics, poetry or prosody, Chanda Shastra or Padya Shastra, Kavya Shastra, musical aesthetics, music criticism, history of music traditions, and here we can find that most of these areas were transferred through oral tradition and not scholastic tradition. I here want to mention one very interesting point, that most of the musicological texts or treatises in ancient times and also in some way medieval period, they don't talk about the musicians. Who were the musicians at ancient times? We don't know. We don't know a single name of a musician or a performer. What songs they were singing, we don't know. The ancient texts only talk about swara, shruti, gram, murchana, the elaboration techniques, but they don't mention a single artist or a musical form. Yes, in Sangeet Ratnakar there is a Prabandhadhyaya in which we find, there were almost 1,000 song types. But what were the examples? They have given some examples, like even Bharata Bhashya. There are examples of songs, and these songs are not just art music or Raga Sangeet. Because Bharata Bhashya or even Manasallas talks about Ovi, Ovenaka and Dhavala Prabandha, that is Dhaval Gita, that marriage, wedding songs. So all kind of Archarya Giti, which were religious songs. So all kind of music making in the society was addressed in that. They were not just talking about art music or Raga Sangeet. Even though they are explaining what is Raga and all that sort of concepts. But they are addressing the music making in totality in the society, because they have an understanding that music making is not just confined to certain class, certain community or certain appreciators. Now here we need to know that which were the places of music making at that time and today also. Music can be produced on any kind of ceremony, religious ceremony or social rite. It can be produced in the homes like lullabies or Stri Geet or Ovi, or it can be performed in royal palaces at that time. And the nature of music performance was different in all such places. Acoustics were different, and according to that, music making or the performing strategy was different. And naturally they are not addressing all this, because this is changing, and they are mostly talking about the elements which are not changing that speedily. जो संकल्पनाएं अधिक समय तक कायम रहती हैं, उनके बारे में ज़्यादातर वो बात करते हैं. And that's why we find that even though the concept of grama or murchana was not practiced in say 14th or 15th century, most of the musicological texts explain that. And that's why Bhatkande found, there is a great disconnect, because we are not practicing this, and why we are discussing all these concepts in musicological texts. There is no need.
मला असं विचारायचं की जसं आपल्याकडे मंदिरांवर जे शिल्प आहेत तर त्यांचे जे बनवणारे जे शिल्पकार आहेत त्यांची नावं कुठेच नाही, कारण त्यांना त्या काळात म्हणजे मला माहिती नाही, पण त्यांना क्राफ्टमन समजलं जायचं, तसंच इकडे या म्युझिशियन्सला फक्त क्राफ्टमन समजलं जायचं.
Not.
Excuse me, please. Translation.
Yeah.
I think what he's saying is that in our temples, similarly we don't know the names of the people who made the temple architecture or the statues there. And maybe their names are not recorded because they were considered craftsmen, not artists. So he's asking, is it the same case in music? For musicians, we don't know the names of the musicians because they were considered craftsmen, not artists. Right?
No, I don't think like that. See, very interestingly, after say 15th century, with Persian texts, we find lot of names of the artists. Even their anecdotes were mentioned there. Because there is a certain shift in musicological text writing. As we know that Persian tradition is very keen in maintaining the records, Tawarikhnama or Bakhar. So in every royal court they have a historian who is writing all the events and incidences. Is keeping the record. So with the Persian musicological texts we find the reflection of that. And in ancient Indian tradition we don't find that. Because व्यक्ति तो आती जाती रहती है ना, and व्यक्ति is not important, समष्टि is important. That is the thought.
I just want to get a suggestion. I don't know if this will work or not. Maybe musicological texts are not the place where you look for names of musicians and names.
Yeah.
Maybe if you go to temple inscriptions, they might
Yeah,
know the person here who sang and she was supposed to be a great.
Yeah.
So the categories of text as
Exactly.
you're mentioning make a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
Like in Jataka tells, we find a mention of a lot of musicians. Jataka tells
A
us.
little bit more.
Yeah.
If we look at the inscriptions of particularly the Chalukyas and the Hoysalas, 8th to the 14th centuries, we find a whole lot of names and we find schools also.
Yes.
So and so belong to the school of stonecutters, so and so belong to the school of writers. We got mention of all of this, we're looking in the wrong place.
Yeah.
The grammatical texts
Grammatical
are not
texts
the
are-
place
yeah.
where
Grammar excludes the individual to concentrate on grammar.
Yeah. And again, there is a philosophical thought, because even like the regional tradition, they don't mention, like specifically, कि इस प्रांत में इस प्रकार का संगीत है, ऐसा कुछ मेंशन नहीं है टिल 17th century क्योंकि ये प्रांतिक वेरिएशंस तो होते रहेंगे और वो बदलते, बिकॉज इट्स स्थल काल सापेक्ष है. Why to mention it? So the grammar texts don't talk about that. And of course, they find the concepts more valid than the personal expression. And that is, I think, very important stance of musicological texts. Or any grammar texts of other subjects also. Like most of the Kavya Shastra texts don't give the names of the poets. Yeah, they give examples of certain poets' lines, but they don't give the life sketch of them, such poets. And even most of the musicologists or the authors of the text also don't give their life sketch. And that's why we don't know who were these musicologists, from where actually they belong. Sometimes in the text, like Sangeeta Ratnakar, he explains that his grandfather was Bhaskaracharya, he was from Kashmir, and he was a Shaivite scholar, Kashmir Shaivism. But such references are very scarce in musicological texts. Again, there is a very interesting thing to note that most of such texts were written under certain patronage of a king. And there is again the debate, like we find a text with the name of king. Manasullas was written by Someshwar Chalukya II. So he was a real author of that, or some other people wrote it in his name. We don't know. It might be a certified thought, we can say. पंडित मंडली होती थी और जिसमें कई सारे लोग मिलकर चर्चा गुण चर्चा करते थे और वो एक टेक्स्ट बनता था और उसको नाम दिया जाता था किंग का क्योंकि उसने पैटर्नाइज किया है. एंड इंटरेस्टिंगली आफ्टर 14th century or 15th century we find texts not mentioning the patron king. That is again a very interesting shift.
Or even the name of Bharat is also, there are many people named after Bharat.
Yeah, it was a community of performers. Bharata was not singer. That's why in Bharatanatyam Shastra, the term Bharata is mentioned quite a lot of time in plural. It is not a singular term. And again, when we see Dattilam, he claims to be the son of Bharata. But again, in Dattilam, he addresses Bharata in plural. So how can one person be a son of many Bharatas? So of course it was a tradition carried forward by one person from the same community of scholars. We can say that. Yeah. Then in Sangita Sambandha Shastra, the third level of Shastra, we find that it's theory related to the music but not confined to music making. So we can say it's like in modern perspective it is cultural musicology or interdisciplinary approach to music theory. And we find many topics like codification of music in different communities or different cultures, or how the basic scale is perceived in different schools. Again, yeah, I want to mention that unfortunately in Indian tradition or Granthik Parampara, we don't find a mention of which tradition they are addressing. We believe that before Sangeet Ratnakar there was one system of music and then it was bifurcated in Carnatic and Hindustani. It's believed that with Persian influence the northern Indian music got changed. It's not true actually. There was influence of other music cultures on South Indian music also. And like when in southern text we find the word like Turushka Priyarag. What is that? Who are these Turushka? They are foreigners. As we know, there was a constant exchange of trade between Arabs and Turkish people to the southern part of India. They were coming here, they were staying here, and the melodies which were favored by them, or which the melodies which we borrowed from them, they were called as Turushka Priya. And of course, I don't intend to play some music because my time is short. Interestingly, we find many similarities in music making or voice production in the region from Arabistan to northern African regions to South Indian music. There are a lot of similarities. Even the concept of rhythm and how to explore the rhythm is very similar.
You must give us an example if you can.
Okay. I need my hard disk. I can play.
If it's possible.
Yeah, it's possible, but it will take a little time. Can you pass my backpack?
म्हणून त्यांचं जे हलंत स्वर जो आहे म्हणजे
And even Yes, yes, sure.
So, I mean, well, you can share
My question
questions.
is we can ask questions if you don't.
हाँ हाँ. Yeah. Yeah.
There is this interesting notion that I have heard at a lot of places, where art always precedes and succeeds science.
Yes, yes. Of course.
So I kind of always used to relate that with music, where we say that the entirety or the maximum portion of what we listen to as Indian classical comes a lot from folk cultures or folk tunes. Does it also happen that it is kind of trickled down into folk music further? Like the pop music which we consider today to be Bollywood music also has tunes coming from, say, there is this really good Gatin Malcolms which was frequently performed by Bismillah Khan, which was later appropriated as this piece in really funny sounding songs, which is da 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 da. So this sort of appropriation, this is also a sort of trickle down movement of what we consider to be classical music. Does that often happen?
There is always a give and take in folk traditions and so-called art music traditions. When we sing Kajri, it's a folk song which is elevated to a now Raga Sangeet idiom. And going back, actually, popular music always picks components of music from folk music and Raga Sangeet also. As we know that when talkies started in India in 1931, the film music started, and most of the musicians or composers were from either Natya Sangeet or Nautanki or Raga Sangeet musicians, and they picked up the tunes from their repertoire. Naushad Saab, he has extravagantly used the Purbi tunes in his music. But interestingly, there is again a process of going back to the, like, many popular tunes are absorbed by the folk musicians and they sing as folk music. And now today it's very hard to identify which was the original folk tune and which is the adapted folk tune. And again, the folk musicians or even the so-called illiterate Raga Sangeet musicians of the bygone era, they were very, very clever musicians. उनको ये पता होता था कि कहाँ से क्या उठाना है और उसका रूप अपने ढांचे में कैसे डालना है. डॉक्टर रानडे ने एक बहुत मज़ेदार इंसिडेंट बताया था कि वो फोक म्यूजिशियंस के साथ काम कर रहे थे सिंध के एरिया में, और एक नगारची था और वो नगारे पर ताल का प्रस्तार बजा रहा था. एंड डॉक्टर रानडे ने उनको पूछा कि ये आप जो बजा रहे हैं वो आपके पुरखों से चला रहा है? तो हाँ बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. तो उन्होंने फिर से थोड़ी देर के बाद पूछा कि क्या आपने बनाया है या आपके दादा परदादा भी ये बजाते थे? हाँ हाँ बिल्कुल. 2-3 दिन उनको ऐसे ड्रिल करने के बाद उन्होंने कन्फेस किया कि उनके पास ताल प्रकाश जो एक ग्रंथ है उसकी कॉपी है और उसमें ताल पद्म दिया जाता है. माने there is a certain diagram which gives a mathematical calculation how to explore the tal, and he has studied that and he has imbibed the technique of tal prastar of pakhavaj into nagara play. Now see, the so-called art music tradition has reflected into the so-called folk music tradition, and this kind of give and take is always there. अब जैसे कि हमारे यहाँ जो लगभग 30s से लेकर 60s तक लावनी सिंगर्स थे और लावनी डांसर थे, उस ज़माने में जो कुछ राग संगीत और कथक का प्रसार होता रहा, उन्होंने उसमें से भी कुछ चीज़ें उठाई थी. तो कई सारे लावनी डांसर के स्टेप्स में हम देखते हैं कि कथक के स्टेप्स आए थे, इवन भरतनाट्यम के स्टेप्स आए थे. तो अगर हम देखें कि ये कहाँ से आया और कहाँ गया, So it's really very confusing or ambiguous.
Actually, Ravindra Sangeet has taken a lot.
Yes, of course. Yeah, there are some.
There are tunes, old tunes that are there in Ravindra.
Yeah.
So I mean, the word appropriation is being used now.
Yeah.
But I think, one needs to also see what are the conditions under which you can comfortably use the word appropriation. Because otherwise, then we are creating precedences that later on will create problems for us. And because how do we move forward? We are all going to be influenced by, and increasingly we live in such a multi-experiential world, then ownership and appropriation, this will become a very conflicted area, and art cannot be such a conflicted area.
And if you look at it, abhangs, dasarapadas, etc. have come into classical music, right? Art music.
Yeah, like most of the art musicians have picked the saint literature and they are singing it like her. It's a common.
So very nice way that you use it. Give and take.
Yes, it's a give and take.
Yeah, that's the negotiation.
Yeah. Okay, then now let us listen to the Sudan music. You're not able to see the video actually. Here there is a lead singer and there is a group of co-singers, and the lead singer is playing a sort of instrument like khanjiri. Again, a similar instrument in Carnatic music. And he's playing with cycle of 3/3. And the others are clapping with a syncopating pattern of 7 or 9. Again, a very same concept like in Carnatic music we use jati bhed or gati bhed.
Sounded like Sudha the Cascade.
Yeah, of course.
मी धनश्री पंडित राय जे आहेत त्यांच्याशी बोललेलो तेव्हा ते बोललेले की ठुमरीला सॉर्ट ऑफ असं मेन स्ट्रीम किंवा क्लासिकल कन्सिडर केलं नव्हतं. इज देअर एनी थ्रेशोल्ड आफ्टर विच इट इज अज्युम्ड टू बी क्लासिकल और नॉन क्लासिकल? how are these negotiations sort of discussed also?
Actually, in music making there is nothing like Puritan or say polluted, primarily, and that's why Ustad Abdul Karim Kasab or Fayaz Kasab picked up that thing because it was interesting for them to present in the concert performances. But there were some social notions which were not letting the musicians to use that, because most of the times the thumri was related to a certain class of musicians, Naach girls or Tawayafs or Baijis, or in South Indian music Devdasis, and the social taboos were there, and that's why the music was forbidden. Actually, the musical content is not forbidden, and that's why the musicians used to pick up the composition, the sort of voice texture, or the techniques of improvisation from Thumri. But sometimes they were not addressing it as Thumri. So again, there is a certain kind of negotiation based on the cultural connotations. Because music making is not in a vacuum. It's part of the society. As Srijan pointed out yesterday, that as Fayaz Kasab was having a direct exposure to that kind of music making on kothas, he was able to grasp it. अब विष्णु दिगंबर पलस्कर को वो नहीं था ना एक्सपोजर, और उन्होंने एक्चुअली ड्यू टू द सोशल टैबूज उन्होंने ये भी किया कि वो तवायफों को या देवदासियों को सिखाएंगे नहीं. दैट वाज आल्सो हिज स्टांस. लेकिन उनके कंटेम्पररी थे वज़े बुआ, उनकी प्राइमरीली जो पहली शिष्याएं थी वो सब जो हम गोवा का कलावंत समाज कहते हैं वहाँ से थी. तानेबाई दत्तूगावकर या केशरबाई केरकर. शी लर्न primarily under Wazibu Arliya, and then later she.
So it's mostly social pressure or always social pressure?
I think it's mostly social pressure.
Maybe the South is slightly different.
Yeah.
They have actually adopted the
Yeah.
Kalā and Kārigari that the Sanskrit dance tradition.
Yeah.
And a lot of male art musicians have composed for the village.
Yeah.
That extent is there, but maybe a regional difference.
Yes, a regional difference. In certain way, even in a northern part, it was like मैं एग्जाम्पल देता हूँ. हमारे महाराष्ट्र में जो पहले ज़माने में लावणी गाने वाली बाइयाँ थी, वो सब महार या मांग कम्युनिटी से थी. अगेन सोशली सॉर्ट ऑफ दलित क्लास. हाँ, लेकिन उनको लावणी की तालीम देने वाले कौन होते थे? एक तो जैसे कि एक प्रसिद्ध ये है कि पंढरपुर के जो रुक्मिणी देवी के जो पुजारी हैं उत्पाद, दे आर ब्राह्मण्स. दे यूज टू टीच लावणी टू देम, सो दे वर द लावणी कंपोजर्स ऑल्सो. इवन Guru priests, they used to teach music to them. So there was again always a give and take between these communities or social classes also. And that's why we don't like to think Indian music in the Western thought, like community-based discrimination. Indian art music was never only of Brahmins. अभी किसी ने एक आर्टिकल मुझे भेजा था जिसमें लिखा था कि कैसे ध्रुपद वो ब्राह्मणिक आर्ट थी और उसको कैसे मतलब. दिस इज बुलशिट. इट्स नथिंग टू डू विथ अ सर्टन कास्ट. अब विष्णु दिगंबर जी ने उनके इसमें बताया है कि मथुरा में जब गए तब बहुत अच्छे ध्रुपद एक को आते थे, और कौन था वो? भंगी था, और उस भंगी से उन्होंने काफ़ी सारे ध्रुपद सीखे थे. तो ये क्या है? ये we can say that it's cross section of social communities. They were sharing the music. ऐसा नहीं था कि socially lower classes सिर्फ folk music करते थे और higher classes were into rag music or art music. It's not true in Indian scene. So आजकल ये बहुत सारा मैं कहता हूँ कि अमेरिकन इन्फ्लुएंस रिसर्च चल रहा है, उसके बारे में बोला जाता है. अगेन लिटिल बिट मार्क्सिस्ट और सोशलिस्ट हिस्टोरियंस आल्सो दे आर पुटिंग लाइक इट. बट इफ यू लुक इनटू इंडियन ट्रेडिशन और इंडियन हिस्ट्री ऑफ म्यूजिक, वी वुड नॉट फाइंड दैट लाइक देयर आर नो सच डायरेक्ट कनेक्शंस. इट्स वेरी एक्चुअली confusing to understand and dissection it.
Basically, what you're saying is that they were all coexisting and there was a good interplay
Yes,
between
yes,
all
yes.
communities.
Yeah.
Whereas these demarcations are much more in recent times and probably from a very Western approach of looking at the Indian society.
Yeah.
And it's not so neatly packaged also.
Yes,
But
yes,
they're
yes.
just
Ah.
disrupting the idea that there was no.
Simplify the construct.
I mean, it sounds very neat.
No, but even when
We
Ashish
want
ji said,
to look for organization in society like that. But society is organized under sort of the musical categories
Yes.
because it's basically musical actions that are
Exactly.
organized. Not in that sense relationship.
It's
so
as if
whereas
we were
in
doing
the,
like
even in the context of the way Ashish ji was talking in the morning, because there was so much interplay between all communities.
Always actions.
So that
you
action
can't
here
explain this
also.
question so अच्छा ये करते थे तो ये साथ में बैठ के खाते थे.
हाँ, ऐसा भी नहीं
That's
होता
not
था.
a question
हाँ,
that you
it's
can
not
ask.
like that.
But in terms of craft action, musical action, social action, so that certain purposes are achieved, they've always been negotiations, and that has kept all of these crafts vibrant. That's all that one can say,
Like,
and that needs to be said.
yeah, I will give an example. Like Ram Joshi was from Brahmin community. He was Kirtankar, from Kirtankar family. Then he shifted to Tamasha and Lavani. So he was in a way outcasted by the Brahmins. But his music was not outcasted. Brahmins were enjoying his music. Huh? Even in Peshwa court, he was performing. So his music was not outcasted. He was outcasted on the terms of social behavior. Huh. Yeah, sure.
Talking from the perspective of history alone and not music. Typically, the word nature, which is today used to mean outcast, was used to describe a person who did not follow your cultural norms. So you could do business with them, but you would not invite them home for a meal. That is where you need to locate music. This old concept that has become auspicious later, which is a later development. But your original nature was the Yavana, the Greek, who followed a different eating system. That is what we need to do.
Again, from eating system, I remember anecdote, like it's mentioned, like Mohubai Kurdikar, she belonged to the Kalavanta class of Goa, so they were in a way socially lower. Huh? And even though she was a high stature performer at her time, in Goa, she was not allowed to enter in the house of the Brahmin priests. और उनको नारळाची करवंटी काय म्हणायचं त्याला? हाँ, उसमें चाय या पानी उसमें दिया जाता था. हाँ? Yes. So her music was chaste and Puritan or divine, वगैरह वगैरह. But her social position was not that of equivalent to the. Yes.
So we spoke a lot about where you can find the names of different musicians. My question is, why do you need to know their names?
Yeah. In a way, to understand the music making or the conceptual part of music, we don't need the names of the musicians. But as for interest out of knowing the music history as a whole, it's better to know who are the musicians, from where they came, what was their journey, and that's why we